I lost my wife after 42 years of marriage and thought my life was over. At 69, I bought a one-way ticket to Malta just to escape the emptiness. What I found on that tiny Mediterranean island changed everything. My name is William Thompson. Everyone calls me Bill. And I'm about to tell you how losing everything led me to find a life I never imagined was possible. For 42 years, Patricia and I had the kind of marriage that people used to call solid. We weren't the couple who wrote love poems or took romantic weekend getaways, but we were steady. She made her famous pancakes every Sunday morning while I read her the sports scores. We watched Jeopardy together every evening at 7:30, competing to see who could answer more questions correctly. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our comfortable silences. We'd tried for children early in our marriage, but it wasn't meant to be. After years of hoping and disappointment, we'd made peace with it being just the two of us. Patricia threw herself into her job as a high school English teacher, and I built my career as an electrical engineer for the city. We had our work, our small circle of friends, and each other. It felt like enough, more than enough. The stroke hit Patricia on a Thursday afternoon in October. She was grading papers at the kitchen table when I heard a strange sound, like someone dropping books. I found her slumped over, her red pen still in her hand, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Bill," she whispered, her words slurred and barely audible. "I can't. Something's wrong." Those were the last coherent words she ever spoke to me. The ambulance ride felt like hours, though it was only 12 minutes to the hospital. The doctors used words like massive and extensive damage and prepare yourself. They kept her alive on machines for 3 days while I sat beside her bed, holding her hand and telling her about the students who'd called asking about makeup assignments, about the neighbor's cat who kept sitting on our porch waiting for her to come home and give him treats. On Sunday morning, with the autumn light streaming through the hospital window, the machine stopped beeping. Just like that, 42 years of shared life ended in a sterile room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The funeral was everything Patricia would have hated. Too formal, too final. Her teaching colleagues spoke about her dedication to her students. Our neighbors talked about her beautiful garden and her famous Christmas cookies. Everyone said the right things about celebration of life and cherished memories, but all I heard was the deafening silence that would be waiting for me at home. For 8 months after Patricia died, I tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. I kept our routines out of habit, made coffee for 2 and threw half away, set the table for dinner and ate standing at the counter because sitting alone at our dining room table felt like admitting defeat. I watched Jeopardy by myself and found that all the answers I'd known when she was there had somehow disappeared with her. Friends and neighbors were kind in that awkward way people are with the recently widowed. They invited me to dinner parties where I sat like a ghost among the living, making polite conversation about weather and local politics, while inside I felt like I was disappearing a little more each day. My brother called weekly from Arizona, suggesting I get back out there and start socializing again, as if 42 years of love could be replaced by joining a seniors book club or taking up golf. But I wasn't just grieving Patricia, I was grieving the man I'd been with her. Bill Thompson, Patricia's husband, had been someone I understood. This new man, Bill Thompson, widower, was a stranger I didn't know how to be. That's when I remembered Frank Mitchell. Frank and I had worked together at the Department of Public Works back in the 80s and 90s. He was one of those guys who always talked about retiring somewhere warm and exotic, somewhere he could drink wine in the afternoon and watch the sun set over the ocean without feeling guilty about it. We'd lost touch after he retired in 2003, but I'd heard through mutual friends that he'd moved to some island in the Mediterranean and was living what he called the good life.
I found his contact information in an old Christmas card Patricia had saved. She'd kept every card we'd ever received, organized by year in shoe boxes in the closet. When I called him, his voice sounded exactly the same, just with a slight echo that reminded me he was thousands of miles away. "Billy Thompson," his voice boomed through the phone. "Holy hell! How long has it been? How's that beautiful wife of yours?" When I told him, the line went quiet for a long moment. I could hear voices in the background, speaking in what sounded like a foreign language, and the distant sound of church bells. "Ah, Jesus, Bill," he said finally, his voice soft now. "Patricia was a good woman. I'm so goddamn sorry." We talked for over an hour. I found myself telling him things I hadn't been able to say to anyone else, about the crushing loneliness, about waking up every morning with nothing to look forward to, about feeling like I'd died along with her, but somehow my body had forgotten to stop breathing. "You know what you need?" Frank said finally. "You need to get the hell out of that house full of ghosts. Come visit me." "Visit you where?" "Malta. It's this tiny island in the Mediterranean between Sicily and North Africa. Most Americans have never heard of it, but Bill, it's paradise. The weather's perfect, the people are incredible, and nobody here gives a damn about your past. They just care about who you are right now." I almost laughed. "Frank, I'm 69 years old. I don't speak the language. I don't know anything about Mediterranean islands, and I've never traveled anywhere more exotic than Canada." "Perfect," he said. "That means you're ready for an adventure. Look, I've got a spare room and nothing but time. Come stay for a month. See if you like it. Worst case scenario, you go home with a tan." I thought about it for 3 days. The old Bill Thompson would have thanked Frank politely and stayed home. But the old Bill Thompson had been buried with Patricia, and this new version, this hollow, desperate version, was just crazy enough to consider it. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to Malta with 2 suitcases and no return ticket. The flight from Denver to Malta took nearly 18 hours with connections in Frankfurt and Rome. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I started to panic. What was I doing? I was 69 years old, recently widowed, flying to a country I had to look up on a map to find. I didn't speak Maltese or Italian or whatever they spoke there. I didn't know anything about the culture, the food, or the customs. All I knew was that Frank Mitchell thought it would be good for me, and that staying in Denver was slowly killing me. When the plane finally descended toward Malta International Airport, I pressed my face to the window and got my first glimpse of the island that would change my life. It was smaller than I had imagined, just a tiny dot of golden limestone surrounded by impossibly blue water. The capital city, Valletta, looked like something from a movie, with honey-colored buildings stacked on top of each other like ancient Lego blocks. Frank met me at baggage claim, and if I hadn't heard his voice on the phone, I might not have recognized him. 20 years of Mediterranean sun had turned his pale Irish skin to leather and bleached his red hair nearly white, but his eyes still had that same mischievous spark that got us both in trouble with supervisors back in Denver. "Welcome to the best-kept secret in Europe, brother." He pulled me into a bear hug that smelled like sea salt and red wine. The drive from the airport to Frank's house took about 30 minutes through narrow streets that looked like they'd been built for horses, not cars. Even at 10 p.m., the island felt alive in a way that Denver never had. People sat outside cafes and restaurants, talking and laughing and gesturing with their hands. Children played in small squares while their parents watched and chatted with neighbors. It was community in a way I'd forgotten existed. Frank lived in a small fishing village called Marsaxlokk on the south coast of the island. His house was a traditional Maltese townhouse, 3 stories of honey-colored limestone with bright blue shutters and a rooftop terrace that looked out over the harbor where colorful fishing boats bobbed in the gentle waves. "This is your room," Frank said, showing me to a guest bedroom on the 2nd floor, with windows that opened directly onto the Mediterranean. "Stay as long as you want. Forever if you like it here." That first night, I lay in bed listening to sounds I'd never heard before. Waves lapping against stone, seagulls crying in the distance, and what sounded like an entire neighborhood having dinner together on their terraces. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel crushing. It felt peaceful.
The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and fresh bread. Frank's wife, Isabella, a small, energetic Maltese woman in her 60s who spoke English with a musical accent, had prepared what she called a proper Maltese breakfast. Fresh bread with tomato paste, olives, capers, and local cheese, along with coffee so strong it could wake the dead. "Frank told me about your wife," Isabella said as she poured my coffee, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "I'm very sorry for your loss, but you're here now, and in Malta we believe that anyone who comes to our island is meant to be here." After breakfast, Frank took me on a walking tour of Marsaxlokk. The village was built around a natural harbor filled with traditional fishing boats called Lucias, painted in bright blues, yellows, and reds, with eyes painted on the prows to ward off evil spirits. The waterfront was lined with restaurants and cafes where fishermen sat mending nets and old men played cards in the morning sunshine. "This is the Sunday market," Frank explained, as we walked through rows of stalls selling everything from fresh fish to handmade lace. "It's been happening here for centuries. Same families, same traditions, just passed down from generation to generation." What struck me most was how everyone seemed to know Frank. Vendors called out greetings in Maltese, old men clapped him on the shoulder, and children ran up to hug his legs. He wasn't just living in Malta, he'd become part of it. "How long did it take?" I asked him, as we sat at a harborside cafe, watching the boats sway gently in the morning breeze. "How long did what take?" "To feel like you belonged here, instead of just visiting." Frank thought about it while sipping his espresso. "About 6 months," he said finally. "That's when I stopped thinking about what time it was in Denver and started thinking about what I wanted to have for lunch." That afternoon, Frank suggested we visit a friend of his who ran a small tailor shop in the village. "Carmen's been here her whole life," he said. "She makes the best traditional Maltese clothes on the island. But more importantly, she makes the best pasticci you'll ever taste." Carmen turned out to be a woman about my age, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and hands that moved with the practiced precision of someone who'd spent decades working with fabric and thread. Her shop was tiny but immaculate, filled with colorful fabrics and the soft whir of sewing machines. She was hemming a dress when we entered, and she looked up with curious dark eyes. "Frank," she said in accented English, setting down her work, "you brought your friend from America." Frank made the introductions, and Carmen studied me with the frank assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people through their posture and the way they carried themselves. "You look tired," she said simply, "and sad, but also," she tilted her head considering, "also ready for something new." I found myself nodding. It was exactly how I felt. Carmen disappeared into the back of her shop and returned with a plate of pasticci, flaky pastry filled with ricotta cheese or mushy peas that were still warm from the oven. As I ate, she asked gentle questions about where I was from and what had brought me to Malta. I found myself telling her about Patricia, about the emptiness I had left behind in Denver, about not knowing what to do with the rest of my life. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. "Loss is like the sea," she said when I finished, gesturing toward the harbor visible through her shop window. "Sometimes it's calm, sometimes the waves crash over you and you think you'll drown. But the sea is always there, and eventually you learn that you can float in it instead of fighting it." I looked at her, struck by the simple wisdom in her words. "You speak from experience?" "My husband died 6 years ago," she said matter-of-factly. "Heart attack. We had 38 years together. Good years mostly. Hard years too, but good." She paused, folding the dress she was hemming with careful precision. "But life doesn't end when someone we love dies. It just changes shape, like fabric when you cut it for a new pattern." Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to Carmen's shop almost daily. Sometimes I came to buy shirts or have pants hemmed. Frank insisted I needed clothes more suitable for the Mediterranean climate. Sometimes I came to sit in her small back room and drink coffee while she worked, but mostly I came for the quiet conversations with a woman who understood loss without trying to fix it or explain it away. Carmen had a way of making me feel useful without making it obvious. She'd ask my opinion on fabric choices for customers, or have me help move bolts of cloth, or taste test new recipes she was trying for the pastizzi. She treated me like a neighbor, not a charity case. "You have good hands," she'd say, watching me help organize her button collection. "Steady hands. My husband had hands like yours, engineer hands." Slowly, I began to feel less like a visitor and more like a person with a place in the world again.
The turning point came about 6 weeks after my arrival. I was having dinner at a small restaurant near Carmen's shop when a little girl appeared at my table, maybe 9 years old, with dark curls and enormous brown eyes that reminded me of Patricia when she was young. "Excuse me," she said in careful English. "Nana Carmen says you're from America and you tell good stories. Is that true?" I looked around and saw Carmen watching from across the restaurant, a slight smile on her face. "This is my granddaughter, Lucia," Carmen explained, coming over to our table. "She's staying with me for the summer while her parents work in Germany. She's very curious about America." Lucia climbed into the chair across from me and waited expectantly. I hadn't told a story to a child since, well, maybe ever. Patricia and I had never had children of our own, and we'd somehow missed out on having nieces and nephews or close friends with kids. But something about Lucia's hopeful expression made me want to try. I started with a simple story about the time Patricia and I had driven to Yellowstone National Park and gotten stuck in a traffic jam caused by a herd of buffalo. I told her about how the buffalo had surrounded our car for 20 minutes and how Patricia had rolled down the window to take pictures while I sat terrified that one of them would decide our Honda Civic looked like a threat. Lucia giggled at all the right places and asked a dozen questions about buffalo and national parks and whether all Americans lived in places where wild animals could stop traffic. "Will you tell me another story tomorrow?" she asked when I finished. I glanced at Carmen, who nodded encouragingly. "I think I'd like that very much." And so began a routine that would reshape the rest of my time in Malta. Every evening after dinner, I'd stop by Carmen's shop or meet them at one of the harbor restaurants, and Lucia would claim the chair across from me for story time. I told her about growing up in Colorado, about the electrical systems I'd designed for the city of Denver, about the time Patricia and I had taken a train across the country and gotten snowed in for 3 days in Nebraska. Lucia absorbed every detail like a small sponge, and slowly I began to remember that my life had been full of experiences worth sharing. The three of us became an unlikely family of sorts. Carmen would cook traditional Maltese dishes and teach me their names in Maltese. I'd tell stories about America and help Lucia with her English homework. And Lucia would bridge any gaps between us with her endless curiosity and easy affection. She started calling me Nanu Bill, Grandfather Bill, in Maltese, and the title felt more natural than any I'd ever held. As the summer turned to autumn, I found myself looking forward to each day instead of just enduring it. I learned basic Maltese phrases from Lucia, who was a patient teacher despite her tendency to giggle when I mispronounced words. I helped Carmen with small repairs around her shop, fixing a broken sewing machine and installing better lighting for her work area. And somewhere in the middle of all this ordinary life, I realized something profound. I was happy. Not the same kind of happiness I had had with Patricia. That was irreplaceable, a part of my past that would always be precious to me. But this was a different kind of happiness, built on new relationships and unexpected discoveries about who I could be at 69 years old. One evening in late September, as we sat watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and pink, Carmen asked me a question that I'd been avoiding for weeks. "Your visa, how much longer do you have?" American tourists could stay in Malta for up to 90 days without a special visa, and I'd already been there for nearly 3 months. I'd been trying not to think about it, but the reality was that I'd have to make a decision soon. "About 2 weeks," I admitted. "Then I either have to go home or figure out how to stay longer." Carmen nodded, her fingers working automatically on a piece of embroidery she'd brought to our evening spot. "And what do you want to do?" It was such a simple question, but it hit me like a revelation. For the first time in months, someone was asking what I wanted, not what should do or what made sense or what Patricia would have wanted me to do. "I want to stay," I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. "I want to stay here with you and Lucia and Frank and Isabella. I want to learn more Maltese and help you with your shop and tell stories and watch the sunset over the harbor every night." Carmen smiled, the first truly radiant smile I'd seen from her. "Then you should stay." "It's not that simple. I'd need to apply for residency, prove I can support myself, navigate all kinds of bureaucracy." "Frank did it. Isabella helped him. I'll help you."
That night, I called my brother in Arizona. "I'm thinking of staying," I told him. "Staying where? Malta? For how long?" "Maybe permanently." There was a long pause. "Bill, are you having some kind of mental breakdown? You can't just move to Malta because you're running away from grief." "I'm not running away from grief," I said, looking out at the harbor where fishing boats were preparing for their early morning departure. "I'm running toward something. I'm running toward a life where I feel useful and needed and happy." It took several more conversations to convince him I wasn't having a crisis. I explained about Frank and Isabella, about Carmen and Lucia, about the community I'd found in a place where nobody expected me to be the man I'd been before. The bureaucracy was even more complicated than I had expected. Malta might be tiny, but it takes its paperwork seriously. I needed bank statements and medical records and proof of income and character references and about 50 other documents that had to be translated, notarized, apostilled, and submitted in triplicate. Carmen accompanied me to most of the appointments, translating when necessary and explaining cultural nuances that I never would have understood on my own. Watching her navigate the system with patient determination, I began to understand that she wasn't just helping me with paperwork, she was investing in our future together. The process took 4 months, during which I had to leave Malta twice to reset my tourist status. Once to Sicily for a long weekend, once to Rome for a week that Isabella turned into an impromptu vacation for all of us. But each time I returned to Malta, it felt more like coming home. The day my residency permit was approved, Carmen cooked a feast to celebrate. She invited Frank and Isabella, several neighbors, and what seemed like half the village. Lucia made me a card with a drawing of the 3 of us standing in front of Carmen's shop, all of us smiling under a bright yellow sun. "Now you're really Maltese," Lucia announced proudly as she presented the card. "Almost." That night, Carmen and I walked along the harbor, just the 2 of us. The moon was full,
casting silver paths across the water, and the air was warm, despite the fact that it was January. Do you ever miss it, your old life in America? I miss Patricia. I'll always miss Patricia. But I don't miss being the man who was slowly dying of loneliness and routine. She took my hand then, naturally and without fanfare, the way people do when they found something worth holding on to. "I'm glad you stayed," she said simply. Me too. Now, 2.5 years later, Lucia is 12 and speaks English well enough to correct my Maltese grammar. Carmen and I are officially together, though we've both agreed that neither of us needs the complications of marriage at our age. We're two people who found each other when we'd both assumed that finding was over. I help run Carmen's shop now, and we've expanded to include a small selection of traditional Maltese crafts for the tourists who discover our village. I've learned to make pasticci almost as well as Carmen, though she insists mine are too American because I can't resist adding extra cheese. Sometimes tourists ask me how I ended up in Malta, and I tell them it was an accident. I was running away from something and stumbled into something better. But that's not entirely true. I think maybe I was running toward this all along, I just didn't know what this was. Last month, I got an email from my old neighbor in Denver. He'd been keeping an eye on my house since I left, but the maintenance was getting expensive, and he wanted to know what I wanted to do with it. The roof needed replacing, the furnace was acting up, and the garden Patricia had loved was overgrown with weeds. I had him sell it, all of it. The house, the furniture, the tools in the garage, everything, except a few photos and Patricia's wedding ring, which I still wear on a chain around my neck, right next to a small Maltese cross Carmen gave me for my 70th birthday. I'm 71 now, and for the first time in my life, I'm not counting the years I have left or worrying about what comes next. I've learned that happiness doesn't have to be the same shape it was before. It can be smaller and quieter and still fill all the empty spaces in your heart. Sometimes on quiet evenings, when the shop is closed and Lucia is doing homework upstairs, Carmen and I sit on her small terrace and watch the fishing boats come home with their daily catch. We don't talk much. We've both learned the value of comfortable silence. But I'm not the same man who arrived at Malta International Airport 2.5 years ago, broken and lost, and convinced that his life was effectively over. That man was drowning in memories of what he'd lost, unable to see any future beyond endless empty days. This man, the one who can navigate the Maltese bureaucracy and make a decent cup of Maltese coffee and knows the names of all the fishermen in the harbor, he's too busy living to spend much time drowning. Yesterday, Lucia asked me if I ever miss being American. I told her I'm still American in my heart, but now I'm something else too. I'm Maltese. She thought about this very seriously and then announced that being two things at once makes you twice as interesting. I think she might be right. If you're listening to this and you feel lost, if you feel like your story ended when someone else's did, I want you to know something that took me 69 years to learn. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin in places we never planned to visit, written in languages we never planned to learn, with people we never expected to love. I'm 72 years old, and last month I finally mastered the complex stitch pattern required for traditional Maltese lacework. Next month, I'll become a Maltese citizen. Next year, Lucia and I are planning to visit America together so she can see where I came from. At 72, I'm still learning, still growing, still becoming someone new. If I can do it, you can too.